Hello, and welcome to the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy case study webinar. I'm Dr. Kelly McFarland, Director of Programs and Research at the Institute here at Georgetown University. The Institute's library of over 250 cases applies the case study method used in business schools to the study of diplomacy and international relations. I'm joined today for a conversation about the case study writing process with two of our newest case authors, Rick Moss and Happymon Jacob, whose cases are fantastic additions to the collection. Rick Moss is the author of Case 353, Circumventing the Foreign Policy Bureaucracy, Henry Kissinger, Anatoly Dobrynin, and Back-Channel Diplomacy, which examines the behind-the-scenes communications in the late 1960s and early 1970s between Henry Kissinger, who served as President Nixon's National Security Advisor and later Secretary of State, and Anatoly Dobrynin, the Soviet Union's ambassador to the United States. Rick is an associate professor in the Russian Maritime Studies Institute at the U.S. Naval War College's Center for Naval Warfare Studies. Happymon Jacob is the author of Case 356, Kashmir Back Channel, India-Pakistan Negotiations on Kashmir from 2004 to 2007. His case looks at the secret negotiations between the two South Asian rivals over the disputed territory of Kashmir and the ultimate failure of those talks. Happymon is an associate professor in the Center for International Politics, Organization, and Disarmament in the School of International Studies at Nehru University in New Delhi. So to start things off, and I'll start with you, Rick, first, what was the genesis of your case study? And then we'll go to Happymon to answer as well.
The case study derived largely from my book on back-channel diplomacy, Nixon's back-channel to Moscow. But the origins of that, when I was in graduate school, I was looking at US-Soviet diplomacy, and there were wonderful US sources available. I kind of became an expert on the Nixon presidential recordings, the Nixon tapes of Watergate notoriety. And I had wonderful color and background there. But it was really the publication of the joint exchanges or joint memos from each meeting between Kissinger and Dobrynin, and a project that was done in a better time period for US-Russian relations. But in 2007, it was jointly published in both English and in Russian in various volumes. It's called the Détente Years, and it's an amazing documentary record. So I was able to kind of combine what I saw in terms of written US documents about meetings or decisions, and pardon the dog barking in the background, but was able to combine that with the Nixon tapes and try to find out what was really going on behind the scenes with each of these meetings that Kissinger and Dobrynin had over the various issues in superpower relations, be it nuclear arms reductions or environmental agreements or cooperation in outer space and education and medicine. So again, really the source drove me to that topic, or the sources and the availability of the sources drove me to those topics.
Happymon, what about you?
Thanks, Kelly. You know, I have been participating in track 2 conversations on Kashmir between India and Pakistan for almost 15 years now. So there is, of course, track 1, there is track 2, and there is back channel. So in these track 2 conversations, where you have a lot of former decision makers come to discuss the pathways ahead for India and Pakistan on the Kashmir question, you know, some of them were in the know of a secret deal that India and Pakistan had arrived at in early 2007 on the Kashmir question. So I was intrigued by some of these conversations that were taking place in the track 2 settings in third party, in third country capitals, sometimes in Dubai, sometimes in Bangkok and other places. You know, so 2 questions, the what question and the how question. So what was the secret deal all about? I was very curious about that. So I had some understanding because, you know, there were some reports in the media, and there was a long article in the New Yorker about the Kashmir back channel. So I had some understanding about the what, but I didn't really have much of an idea about the how of it. How did the two sides go about, negotiating with each other, in complete secrecy. So I started sort of digging into some of these sources. I reached out to people in India and in Pakistan. It's pretty tough because we are still not friends with each other. We still have the Kashmir conflict is still ongoing. So I started talking to people on both sides in track two settings outside India and Pakistan. And I had recently written a book on the ceasefire violations that happen on the line of control between India and Pakistan in Kashmir. So I had the so-called reputation, if I may put it that way, of being somewhat objective on the India-Pakistan questions. And so people are willing to talk to me. So I reached out to about 30, 35 people and told them that, I'm writing this book, and they put me in touch with other people, etc. So, so I was part of this ecosystem, that discussed Kashmir and other outstanding India-Pakistan conflicts in the India-Pakistan context. And I think it is the curiosity that I developed as part of these conversations and sideline talks that I had with many people in India and Pakistan that sort of got me interested in the Kashmir back channel, as it were. I hope that answers your question.
No, that's great. And you touched on part of what I'm going to ask next. And one of the interesting things about having you two talk about this too is the different nature of your research and sources, and shows the different nature that can be used to write these case studies. So I'm going to sort of combine the next two questions that we had for both of you. But what did the research and writing process look like for you both? And I know, Rick, yours was heavily into the archives. Happymon, yours was probably more focused around the interviews that you just mentioned. And then also when you were doing the writing process, and I know, Rick, yours case study came after a book was written. Happymon, yours was done while you're writing a book. What did the writing process look like for knowing that this was a case study, that this was something that we aim to have, specific outcomes for students to be used in class? What did that writing process look like when compared to maybe, an academic article or a book or something like that?
For me, the issue was my book was fairly long, and I had I used over 100,000 pages of documents and dozens of hours of Nixon tapes. In fact, my dissertation was close to 100 pages of Nixon tape transcripts that didn't exist elsewhere before I published them, and as a appendix in my dissertation. So I had that rich source material. So the hardest thing for me was really paring it down. And working with the folks at Georgetown was a wonderful experience. I got really constructive feedback as to areas that I could focus more for the audience. And the first rule of anything, whether you're giving a lecture, whether you're writing a book or an article, is to know your audience. And I have to say, working with Kelly and Alistair really gave me a good idea of what the audience needed. And I was able to work from there. So we pared it down pretty significantly. I talk about many more areas in my book than I do in the case study. In fact, there's a lot more wind up in the case study, like the origins of back channels and Nixon and Kissinger's beliefs on the conduct of foreign policy and diplomacy. There's a lot, I guess, is bolstered in that area. So these are good things because you're teaching potential practitioners down the line. The student today, the undergrad who's a junior or a senior in college, may be a policymaker in 15 or 20 years. And looking at how those mechanisms are established, I think was something that helped me focus as well. So great feedback, really positive experience working with the folks there, everyone from Kelly and Alistair to the editors, and able to use some really good graphics, I thought, that help illustrate who the players were and the nature of the negotiations. So,
well, thanks. It was our pleasure. And there is some good video content that went along with your case as well. That you know, you were kind of the guinea pig on us inserting more interactive video content, recording content, and that sort of thing into the cases. So we're also appreciative of you allowing us to kind of mess with your case a little bit from that standpoint. But it all works out really well and is very useful tools. Happymon, what about you?
Right. You know, let me first touch upon the first part of your question as to how the writing process, the research process went in my case. You know, I'm dealing with a very contemporary sort of a case study, so that had its pluses and minuses. You know, the negotiators are still alive. I mean, in Rick's case also, at least one person is clearly still alive and pretty active. You know, on the positive side, I can reach out to some of them and talk to some of them. On the negative side, they're also very wary about talking to me because you know, the agreement that the two sides had arrived at may still have some promise in future, right? And secondly, I think in my case there is nothing in the archives. It's very contemporary, very new, and so archives can provide me with nothing. So I had to sort of, as you pointed out, Kelly, mine is very interview heavy. I had to speak to individuals and based in India and in Pakistan. But I think technology has made things easier now. You know, Zoom, sometimes if you can't meet them in person, you use Zoom or even a telephone conversation for that matter. Thirdly, I think some of them are not very keen on talking to me because, you know, we also have what is called the Official Secrets Act. Which means, you know, people are not supposed to tell you things they're not supposed to tell you. So, and sometimes they don't know whether they're supposed to tell you or they're not supposed to tell you. So there are all kinds of complications of that kind. But I think the reality is that when a researcher like, you know, Rick or me, when we sort of try and reach out to say a lot of people and, you know, connect the dots as it were, people who belonged to various different ministries, different departments, different agencies, you know, they have an agency view, they have a certain departmental view. But when we talk to all of these people or get archives from different departments, we tend to have a comprehensive overview of what may have happened. So sometimes I tell my colleagues that, you know, I may know a lot more than many of these people who were actually involved in the negotiations of this back channel agreement than probably some of them do, because I managed to talk to all of these people from different departments and ministries located in two different countries who don't normally talk to each other. So I think that's sort of the writing process looked like as for me, and how it sort of differed from a book writing process. I think, well, I'm also writing a book on the same topic, but I think as Rick pointed out, it is important to keep your audience in mind. So in this particular case, Alastair and Kelly made it very clear to us that, listen, this is for a particular purpose, and this is the audience of your work. And so I kept in mind, I'm a teacher myself, so I kept in mind the teaching classroom environment when I was writing this case study, right? I mean, so for me, it was on the one hand giving a big picture, at the same time, you know, adopting a very laser sharp precision on the case itself. So there is a conversation that's taking place between the big picture and the sort of the minute details on the other hand. And I think, you know, the case study, unlike a book, will help the instructor to understand the case with relative ease and communicate the key insights from a case to the students. I mean, you know, it is difficult for an instructor to take a look at the book and then sort of explain that to the students as it were, but occasionally is sort of you know, is sort of meant to do precisely that. And also, you know, the case study doesn't give all the answers and all the conclusions, unlike in a book. A book is supposed to give you the conclusion, the insights, the takeaways. The case study doesn't really do that. So a case study sort of makes you think like a teacher. It sort of encourages the students to look for answers and find answers rather than provide all the answers. So I think that's how I sort of differentiate between this case study experience and the book writing experience, as it were.
Yeah, that's great. And you mentioned you both mentioned a number of things on sort of the difference in the writing process, but just sort of to wrap our little webinar up today, what is one final sort of takeaway that you would both have to provide tips to future authors? What is, if you were to get a chance to tell yourself one thing about to know ahead of time of writing your case study before you did it, what would that be?
That's a tough one, Kelly. I have to say, I wish I had realized earlier that I had a lot of latitude for experimenting. So we were able to include things like a document in addition to the photographs, and we may have even included a map. I think so. Just to kind of illustrate it. And in my position, I work with military officers who are all, and the youngest ones are in their late 20s, and some of them are in their 40s. It's a master's only program. So it's been a while since I had taught undergrads, but I was trying to think, what really worked for me. And I wish I had kind of realized that earlier, like when looking for documents and material, because there is rich source material out there. Whether you're talking about India, Pakistan, or you're talking about back-channel diplomacy during the Nixon administration or whatnot, to illustrate and kind of convey those ideas. A picture says 1,000 words. Maps are, incredibly useful for policymakers or students, trying to look at and understand an issue. Like if you're looking at the line of control and between India and Pakistan, that's very illustrative. Seeing that on paper. So I wish I had kind of had that realization a little bit earlier. So I would just encourage, like right from the beginning, future case study authors to really consider that as they're writing and as they're processing the information, to think about good ways to effectively demonstrate the concepts or what's involved.
Yeah, that's a great point to keep in mind, and helps guide the writing process as well. If you can use these things and the different tools that are at your disposal as an instructor too. Happymon.
Thanks, Kelly. I think writing a book is probably easier than writing this case study in some ways, because I think you got to be engaging, right? I mean, in a book, academic books sometimes can afford to be a bit boring, but a case study cannot afford to be boring because students are not going to sort of read through it or sort of understand it if you're not engaging enough. But I think in terms of what to keep in mind, I think one needs to think like a teacher, because if you're a boring teacher, students are not going to listen to you. And the same applies to the case study. If the case study is boring, then students are not going to read it. So it has to be engaging. It has to be a bit creative. And I really liked Nick's case study because it has these videos and interviews and a lot of stuff thrown into it, which mine unfortunately doesn't have. So making the case study interesting with the facts and thought-provoking questions and some additional reading, I think all of that is really, really going to be helpful. But I think perhaps equally important is the fact that don't give all the answers. In a classroom setting too. I mean, a good teacher is not supposed to give all the answers right in the beginning. A good teacher is supposed to let the students find the answers for themselves. So I think a case study also, and you guys sort of told us right at the beginning itself, don't give all the conclusions and don't give all the answers. Ask those thought-provoking questions and let students find the answers and reach their own conclusions. I think that's very useful.
Yeah, the key to the case studies that we talk to all authors about is this idea of experiential learning and making sure that the students, one of the tools for this is not only to learn more facts and information about Nixon's use of back channels or what back channels can do and how to use them, or more facts and knowledge about the India Pakistan Kashmir dispute, but also just to get them to think critically and learn how to think critically. And that's why we really want them to sort of dive into these things and look at what were the key decision points and when did they happen and why did they happen and why did they potentially go this way or that way, and things, and have them sort of come to those on their own. But no, I think this has been useful, and I appreciate both of you taking the time to chat with us today about the writing process for the case studies. And everybody should check out both of your case studies. They're great examples. So thank you very much.